Are we ready?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, wonderful. Hello, and good morning. As you may have guessed, I am Dharmendra Modha. On behalf of IBM's Almaden Research Center, on behalf of IBM's Research Division, and on behalf of whole of IBM, I would like to warmly welcome each one of you to the 2006 Almaden Institute on Cognitive Computing. As you may realize from the flashing names, there are representatives from over 50 different organizations in the room here today. Participants have come from both public and private sectors, universities, government, industry, startup, venture capital firms, media, and think tanks. The event is being simulcast live to IBM T.J. Watson Research Center in both Yorktown Heights and in Hawthorne. So once again, I would like to thank all of you for being here and welcome you. Almaden Institute is a very special kind of an event. Almaden Institute is a forum. It is a dialogue. It is an exchange. The goal is to learn from each other. But the ultimate goal of Almaden Institute is to stir up constructive action that leads to significant positive change in the direction of science, technology, business, and society at large. Almaden Institute is like an intense beam of searchlight that focuses every year on a different timely topic. In past, we have covered nanotechnology, future of work, privacy, autonomic computing, and healthcare. And each of the past institutes have had a significant impact on the field that they have chosen. This year, we shall discuss cognitive computing. Let me briefly frame what cognitive computing is. Perhaps the most enigmatic and most profound open question of our time is, what is mind? Each of us has one, at least one. Yet, there is no formal definition, specification for what mind is. Roughly speaking, mind is a tightly intertwined collection of cognitive processes of perception, memory, language, learning, intelligence, will, and eventually consciousness. Buddha said, we are what we think. With our mind, we make the world. So mind is our most important possession. Where does the mind come from? Well, ancient Greeks thought mind comes from the diaphragm. Shakespeare explained his confusion by having Portia say in Merchant of Venice, tell me where fancy is bred, or in the heart or in the head. Today we know that fancy and all other cognitive phenomena are definitively bred in the head, in the brain. Superficially, brain is a 3-pound piece of meat, 80% of which is water. But at a functional level, brain can be thought of as a graph, a directed graph. The nodes of the brain graph are computational building blocks, the neurons. And the edges between the neurons, the synaptic interconnections, form the directed graph. The function of each neuron is to connect electrical stimulation from those neurons that connect to it and decide whether or not to propagate this stimulation, the disturbance further, and if so, at what rate and at what intensity. The cycle of electrical stimulation begins in the receptor neurons of senses and internal neurons that regulate the body. It is also known that brain is composed of large number of subsystems, such as the cortex, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the basal ganglia. Each of the subsystems is remarkably homogeneous and may, in fact, be governed by a canonical or universal algorithm. So we talked about the mind, we talked about the brain, and that brings us to the main theme. What we are going to examine at the highest level is the question in neurophilosophy: how does the mind arise from the brain? In other words, we're going to focus, since IBM is not in the business of philosophy, a slight variant of this question, computational neurophilosophy. Is there a computational, mechanistic, mathematical theory of how the cognitive processes of the mind arise from the hardware and software of the brain? Such a study is cognitive computing. Cognitive computing is a study of computer science-style hardware and software, algorithms, and architectures that are consistent with known body of facts about neuroscience and exhibit cognitive phenomena. Very simply speaking, cognitive computing is what a philosopher does when he puts neuroscience together with computer science to explain psychology. Cognitive computing is about engineering the mind by reverse engineering the brain. So these 2 days are about open discussion and open forum. As you can tell from the agenda, at this forum, IBM is not preaching. Rather, we are reaching, we are searching, and we are researching. And what makes this exploration very timely is 4 trends. First trend is excess amount of accumulated data about how the brain works at a neuroanatomical, neurophysiological, neuroelectrical, etc. levels. Second trend is tremendous rise in availability of computation power, such as blue gene. For example, a blue gene sits approximately under the very podium on which I stand here today. The third trend is that startups and other business activity designed to harness the power of cognitive computing is on the rise. And finally, the fourth and the most important trend, the trend that we shall focus on, is that there are certain eminent minds of our time, from neuroscience, from computer science, from electrical engineering, from psychology, from neurology, from philosophy, from information theory, from bioengineering, who are beginning to have a dream, a vision of putting together a grand theory, an overarching theory, a top-down theory of how the brain works that is consistent with the body of known data about the brain. So in case you're wondering who these eminent minds are, well, wonder no further. They are here. They are our speakers, they are the panelists, and they are many of the august attendees. So these 2 days, our hope is to engage in debate and discussion to put the whole puzzle together. And the end goal is to inspire our minds and to energize the brains to significantly quicken the pace of innovation in cognitive computing. So those are my remarks to frame this institute and to put the light on the motive for which we brought these people together. So now, before we plunge straight into the technical heart of the matter, I'd like to take a few minutes just to tell you about the breadth, the depth, and the history of Almaden Research Center. And to do this, I would like to introduce a very special person, Dr. Mark Dean. Dr. Mark Dean is the Vice President of Almaden Research Center. He's an IBM Fellow. That award is our highest technical award, and only 50 people from a company of over 300,000 are currently active IBM Fellows. Dr. Mark Dean has made numerous contributions to IT industry. In particular, he was the chief engineer for the development of IBM PCAT, the ESA system bus, and PS2 model 7080. One of these inventions eventually earned him a place in the Inventors Hall of Fame, which is a very rare honor. There are only about 2 other active IBMers with this distinction. He has numerous other honors. He's a member of IBM Technology, member of National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of IEEE, a fellow of AAAS, and many, many others. He has many awards from IBM. He has a PhD in Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Dean to the stage.
Thanks, Amindra. Good morning. It's this is a different group than my traditional research team. Most of them sit in the far back, and these seats are all empty, so it's quite a bit different. So I got to get used to this. Beautiful day outside. I get to come to work every day to this facility. It's an honor and a pleasure. And you're going to get to meet some of the people that I get to work with every day, just tops in their field, and it's a job, a dream job for me. Many of the people know that this is a job that I've dreamed about having. I got lucky enough to be standing in the right place at the right time to have the honor to be here. So thanks for coming. I really look forward to this next 2 days. As you may know or may not know, we've been doing this. This is our 6th Almaden Institute. The previous institutes have yielded very interesting insights. They have started research activities and that are continuing and have actually made significant impact on not only IBM and what it's doing, but the field of science. And I think that's an important message for me to deliver, is that IBM research is a science research operation. It is an exploratory research area. We do study science. We do look into things that other people don't look into or have not yet looked into. We work to be leaders in many of the fields that hopefully at some point will impact our business. And I think that's key. And I want that to be a key message because I think that's important. We have survived many years. This is our 20th anniversary here in Almaden. And we're very proud of the things that we've been able to contribute. And we're continuing to explore new space in computer science, raw technology, storage systems in a new area that we're pushing hard into, and we're calling it services science. Just like computer science was created 50, 60 years ago, we're working to create what we think could be another discipline, and we're calling it services science. So this institute, this particular institute, is very important because it's actually a start to a set of research projects that Demindra will actually be leading. So think of this as a start to what we hope will be a collaboration of mine across, not just IBM, but across the science and the types of things that you in this room are actually trying to do. So I'm interested and excited about what we might discover. Because I personally think we're doing it, we need a change. The IT industry has been doing what we've been doing for years. We've been doing computing, right? We design computers to compute. But one of our challenges now is how do we deal with information? How do we handle all this data that's being created? And I personally think that it's time to change it. Instead of building computers, we need to build systems that are more focused on data, handling data. We've kind of got this computing thing figured out, right? We can do some more tweaks, but we kind of figured it out. But this mass amount of data, we're drowning in it. And there's long lost opportunity in the information that we've been storing. And we need to kind of figure out how to do that better. So I'm hoping this will be one of the possible areas that we might be able to leverage and build things a little differently. Think about systems a little differently than the way we've been thinking about them. So I hope you take that to heart. I'm very honored to have the distinguished speakers and guests that we have today. You'll get to interact among yourselves and with members of the IBM research community, not just here, but we have visitors also from our other research labs. I should mention that this is one of 8 research labs, although I'm biased, this is the prettiest of the research facilities. We might get some arguments from some of our sister communities, but I think it's hard to argue driving up here that is not maybe one of the prettiest facilities that we have. So without taking any more time, and to make sure we keep rolling, I think Deminder's going to come up and introduce our first speaker. Thank you for coming. Enjoy, relax, and maybe you'll get a little bit of time to enjoy the weather. Most of the time we want you in here, but you'll get a little bit of time to enjoy the weather. Deminder, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. So, this session, the first session, I'll be introducing the session chair, will be chaired by the Honorable Mr. Daniel Golden. He is the chairman and CEO of the Intellisys companies, which focus on high-tech consulting and development of biologically inspired computers and robots. Previously, Mr. Daniel Golden served as the NASA administrator from 1992 to 2001. He directly served under 3 U.S. presidents. Before NASA, he served as the VP and general manager of TRW Space and Technology Group, and he began his career at NASA's Glenn Research Center. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He is a fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He graduated from the City College of New York. And it's a tremendous honor for me to welcome Mr. Daniel Golding to the stage to introduce our first speaker.
I have the distinct honor today of introducing a person I greatly admire, Dr. Gerald Edelman. Dr. Edelman is the director of the Neurosciences Institute and the Neurosciences Research Foundation, which is a not-for-profit, publicly funded institute that's the parent to the Neurosciences Institute. Dr. Edelman has dedicated his professional career to expanding our knowledge of the fundamentals, expanding the boundaries of our fundamental scientific understanding. He has pioneered in the field of biophysics, protein chemistry, immunology, cell biology, and neurobiology. Many of his discoveries have led to approaches, processes, products that have improved the quality of life for many on our planet over decades. His early studies on the structure and diversity of antibodies led to the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1972, and his discoveries ended one phase of immunology and started up a whole new phase of immunology. His studies in embryological development led to the discovery of cell adhesion molecules, which has been found to guide the fundamental processes by which animals achieve shape and form and by which the nervous system is formed. Dr. Edelman formulated a detailed theory called neural Darwinism to explain the organization of higher-order brain functions. He and his colleagues at the Neurosciences Institute have over the past 2 decades developed a broad range of brain-based devices as a research tool to understand the brain functions. His most recent work has explored the neural basis of consciousness. I'd like to introduce to you a man who has inspired much of my recent work and one who has many, many years to inspire generations around this planet.
Thank you, Dan. Some days before the opening night of his play, Man and Superman, George Bernard Shaw sent a letter to Winston Churchill. It said, "Enclosed are 2 tickets to the opening night of Man and Superman. Bring a friend if you have one." Churchill wrote back and said, "Thank you for the 2 tickets. Could you send me 2 more if there's a second night, if there is one?" Well, I am happy to see many friends in this audience and also look forward to the first and second days of this grand meeting. I want to thank Dr. Moda and our hosts at Almaden for a signal opportunity. It may seem strange, in fact it is unusual for an empirical scientist to talk about the mind, but not for poets and philosophers. Take, for example, this remarkable fragment from Marianne Moore, the American poet, who said, "The mind is an enchanting thing, is an enchanted thing like the glaze on a katydid wing, subdivided by sun till the nettings are legion, like Giza King playing Scarlatti." And notice the little hint of neuroanatomy in there. The great philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, in his book Science in the Modern World, pointed out that at the very beginnings of Western science, the mind was removed from nature. Here are two of the people whom he singled out. The first one is Galileo Galilei, who most reasonably might be considered the founder of modern physics, certainly, and possibly even the modern scientific approach of experiment as well as hypothesis. He removed the mind for practical reasons. In his essay, The Assayer, he says, "I know that if there were no animals, there'd be no green or warm, but that isn't my concern." So it was for pragmatic reasons. Sometime later, René Descartes, in a search for a method beyond doubt, came to think that there were two kinds of epochs in our life. The first was res extensa, extended things, susceptible to physics, and the other was res cogitans, which was not extended and therefore was inaccessible to physics. Thus began the whole notion of dualism, which persists to this day and certainly is involved in all of our language. Of course, I think it's wrong, but when you think that Descartes is wrong, you wish you could play his wrong notes. The mind was put back into nature, I think, by William James and Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, sort of at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And his book, the great book, The Principles of Psychology, still stands as one of the best phenomenological descriptions of consciousness. Well, since then, as you've heard from Dr. Moda, there have been many advances, and some of these are listed here. We can now actually come down to experimental and theoretical analyses that tell us how the brain is put together, what its fundamental operations are, and how we might connect psychology to biology in terms of perception, memory, and even consciousness. We all know what consciousness is. It is that which you lose when you fall into a deep, dreamless sleep and that which you gain when you wake up again. It seems strange because it combines privacy with ongoing unity and at the same time a remarkable variability from day to day. And the question is, how can we explain this in scientific terms? Well, in this lecture, what I would like to do is approach that problem and consider what we must consider and see how that all turns out. I believe that that requires 4 points. The first is we have to have a global brain theory. It's important because consciousness being at the height of all of these other operations, if you don't have a fundamental base, there's a chance you will go off kilter. The second thing we need to do is show what properties of neuronal populations are in fact responsible for the features of consciousness. The third thing we must do is to find ways of measuring neural correlates of consciousness experimentally. And finally, what we must do is show what the difference is in the brain between those aspects of the brain that give rise to consciousness and those that do not. So in this lecture, that's what I'm going to do, very quickly review some of these facts. And I needn't point out to this audience here that the cerebral cortex is the key evolutionary event that changed Homo sapiens and gave us all of our properties that go beyond the rest of the animal kingdom. I also needn't point out that there are reasonable structures here. As you can see, the Golgi stain of the 6-layered structure of the cortex, and I haven't, for interest of time, gone to how it might hook up in input-output relationships, but there are a set of relationships, at least at one level, of all of these neuronal inputs and outputs. And of course, the neuron itself is the key, and what has happened in recent times is a remarkable elaboration of what happens at the synapse. After the action potential comes and there's release of neurotransmitter from the vesicles in the synaptic cleft and binding to the postsynaptic neuron. Indeed, great progress has been made biophysically for accounting for how synaptic change occurs, how there is strengthening and weakening, changes in efficacy. And here are 2 of the outstanding rules still being expressed. The first, the spike timing dependent plasticity. The second, the Bienenstock BCM model of Bienenstock, Cooper, and Moser. So the fact is that the interesting thing is, can we reconcile these two features? In any event, these features have the quality of precision, and it is an interesting thing that they have not yet been fully reconciled. Eugene Ishikevich and Neeraj Desai have shown that if there's a Poisson distribution and weak correlation amongst neural firings, that you can show a relationship between the two. I dare say Dr. Markram will be considering some of this. Well, if all of this is true and we're making these advances, why is the brain not a computer? Well, as you all can see, this is a reflection of Turing's theorem, a finite state automaton under guidance of a program in which it can read, write, erase, and move at an endless tape and change state. And Turing's great achievement was to show that there is a universal Turing machine which, in fact, can carry out any set of effective procedures or algorithms. So why not the brain? Well, I want to dedicate my remarks to pointing out that, in fact, the brain is not a computer in that sense, that in fact, what it is more like an evolutionary jungle. If you look here at this picture of primeval forest with setting sun of Le Douanier-Rousseau, one of the early Impressionists, and you remove the man and the jaguar, I think it's more like that. That is to say, it has structure, but it has enormous variability. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this lecture, is the fact that the brain is the most extraordinarily variable structure imaginable. That the individuality of each brain in this room is simply striking. And at the same time, the integrative powers are enormous. And so that poses what the question is. So let me start by making that argument. Here's a little course in neuroembryology. After fertilization, in about 100,000 cells after cell division, a flat plate will turn around and become, as you see here, a neural tube. At the same time, after this tube fills with fluid, cells going into the plane of the board, actually from various proliferative regions, will move to make the layers that I showed you in the previous slide, or will move, as in the olfactory system, in considerable distances from the nasal receptors to the olfactory bulb, ultimately giving a very detailed anatomical structure. Well, the interesting thing is this: although there are populations that can be predicted in movement, the individual neurons cannot. From individual to individual, even in twins, the fact is that different neurons move in different ways. Second of all, when you form a structure, for example, like this in the spinal cord, in the so-called substantia gelatinosa, about 75% of the cells die. And they are not the same cells in two different individuals. So there's a stochastic property to neuroembryology that really differs, I think, very much from the way we would build a computer, in fact. And so if we look at the sites and levels of individual variation in the brain, it's absolutely striking how many levels there are to reconcile. Genetics, biochemistry, morphology, neural transport, connection patterns, cytoarchitectonics, the transmitters, the dynamic responses, and glial interactions. I want just briefly to go through that and point out that there's a kind of crisis. Now, I don't mean that in a gloomy sense. I think crises are wonderful in science because they challenge your thought. But if this is true, what I've been saying, then precise pre-specified point-to-point wiring is generally excluded. It can happen, but it's rare. Second of all, uniquely specific connections in general cannot exist, although there are cases such as the Mautner cell in fish where that does occur. But third of all, the divergent overlapping arbors of these neurons imply the existence of a vast number of unidentifiable inputs. I'll show you this. Let me give you three examples here. The first example is the contralateral descending movement detector neuron of the common locust. And these are modern fills in which every aspect, synapses, dendrites, everything, have been worked out. And here are 4 outbred individuals, all carrying out this extensor tibia function of this neuron. But notice how different they are structurally. And if you object because these are not genetically inbred, take this case, which is Daphnia magna, the water flea, in which an identified visual neuron is looked at in these parthenogenetic females that are clones, and yet no two neurons are alike. And even in one individual, in the great Spanish neurohistologist Ramón y Cajal, if you look at the repeating structure inside a rabbit cerebellum, no two are alike. And furthermore, although the slide doesn't show it, it's not dynamic. It's dynamic, in fact. Well, here's an example having to do with this overlap. This is one single projection of an axonal tree from into areas and levels 4, 5, and 6 of the cortex from the thalamus. And look at the region occupied in 3 space of this tree. And what you must understand is the overlap is sometimes up to 75%, so that if a demon was sitting in one of those en passant synapses, he would not know what the source of that input would be. Well, so much for that, but there's also a functional crisis in which, for example, there are silent synapses. A majority of certain anatomical connections are not functionally expressed. As I'll say later, there are functional temporal alterations in the maps of the brain, giving unique maps in each individual, and the variability depends on the available input. Extensive generalization occurs in object language recognition without the need for language, and I find that the most striking and remarkable case. I'll show you that. And finally, there's a unitary appearance to the perceiver of perceptual processes that are in fact based on complex parallel sub-processes which do not have any executive connection. Let me show you an example first of the context dependence of perception. This is from the great Gestalt psychologist Gaetano Canizza, who showed illusory contours. If you look at this figure, I trust everybody here sees an overlapping triangle. If you don't, please raise your hand. I would like to take you to La Jolla and study your brain. Because there is a kind of incorrigibility here, unless, of course, we take away the Pac-Man. Now, if we were a physicist and we measured across this apparent boundary, there would be no energy change. The brain is, in fact, constructive and context-dependent in all of its operations. Here's another picture from Canizza's book in which these Y-shaped figures are connected with lines, and immediately you see a Necker cube. Well, here's the one that really strikes me, and that is this one here, in which you train a pigeon with, in fact, operant conditioning on this fish picture. This was done by Cirella at Harvard. And if you look at this fish, you can recognize it quite easily, and he showed Kodachromes of this kind to the pigeons and rewarded them whenever they guessed that a picture was a fish. So this was a fish. Down here, this was a fish, but all these were rejected at about an 87% level of performance. That's quite remarkable, and we have no really clear-cut idea of how this works. It's certainly not template matching. So from what I've told you so far, we have to conclude that the world is in fact an unlabeled place. Now, in terms of quantum mechanics, there is a theory of shape, but when you come to chairs, trees, podia, speakers, the brain must construct in a context-dependent fashion what's going on and provide a label. If you look at it, brain order shows an enormous variance, and that's what I've been stressing. Perception itself is adaptive and context-sensitive, and motion, which I have not stressed, is actually an essential element in perception. Finally, I believe perceptual categorization and generalization are the fundamental operations that we must understand in detail before we proceed to something as arcane as consciousness. Well, you know, when I was young, I was an absolutely ardent reductionist. But I'm afraid that age has taken care of that for me, and I want to challenge any reductionists in this audience to consider the following story and explain it in molecular terms. It appears that a young man thought his girl was carrying on with someone else in his New York flat, this Coldwater flat down below Greenwich Village. And so he came home early to trap his rival, and she denied everything. They were screaming. He looked under the bed in the closet. He finally landed up at the rear window of this flat and frustrated, but at the last minute looked down and saw a chap on the fire escape below loosening his collar and wiping his brow. He flew into a fit, grabbed a refrigerator, smashed it through and dropped it on this chap's head, whereupon he dropped dead. The scene switches to heaven, and St. Peter says, you have to say how you died, and then you can get in. He said, well, I thought there was some hanky-panky. I came home early. She denied it, but I saw the wretch. The last minute, I must have had an adrenaline fit and a heart attack. And the second fellow said, I can't afford an air conditioner. I came home a little early, stepped out on the fireplace to cool off, wiped my brow, and this refrigerator fell on my head. And the third guy said, I don't know, I was just sitting in this refrigerator, minding my own business. Well, in fact, it's sort of difficult, even as a physical chemist, for me to see how we're going to reduce that. In any case, here is the hero of the story. If we give up logic and a clock, if we consider that the brain is not in any ordinary sense a computer, we have to go to Charles Darwin, who first formulated a remarkable idea that variation was not noise, that variation was a shake on the future. Population thinking, that variation within a population confronting unknown environmental change led on the average to the selection of those variants that were fitter and that matched better, thus increasing the gene frequency of those individuals. I've taken that to construct this theory, which Dan alluded to, neuronal group selection, or TNGS, the theory of neuronal group selection. And it has three stages. The first is that there are, during embryogenesis, which I showed you, the creation of repertoires of circuits. You must imagine really huge numbers of these during the embryogenesis by epigenetic variation and selection. And the rule here, after the first effect of Hox genes and Pax genes and those things which decide your brain is going to be human, is that neurons that fire together wire together. Then overlapping this is the selection amongst the diverse pre-existing circuits by differential amplification of changes in efficacy, as I mentioned before. And although this diagram shows these first two stages of developmental selection and experiential selection, that does not answer the question of spatiotemporal coordination. And for that, and I will have to expand on this later, we have to use a principle called reentry, namely that the brain maps have massively parallel axonal connections connecting them in such a way that when inputs come in, even simultaneous but unrelated inputs, they are coupled through changes in the synaptic strength of these parallel connections. You will remember the classic case is that of the corpus callosum, which has at least 200 million axons connecting the two sides of your cerebral hemispheres. So this is the theory, and I want to say that that was my first goal, to say that, in fact, you can deal with this, except you must remember that while that theory is somatic and it occurs in the lifetime of each individual in its processes, it is still under reflection of evolution because it depends upon value systems. These are groups of neurons with diffuse ascending connections that have phasic firing related to salient events that release neuromodulators all over, not just into clefts, and which, for example, exist in the locus ceruleus, which leads to the release of noradrenaline, to dopaminergic circuits, and very many catecholaminergic inputs, etc. And so it's important to see that it's a balance between the evolutionary constraint of value systems and somatic selection occurring within this system. What is selected? Well, what this says is groups of neurons are selected. As you know, that neurons come in two flavors, excitatory and inhibitory, and to have individual selection, I believe, given the variance, would be out of the question. So it's neuronal group selection. And I want to give you an idea of what the complexity is by using a formulation, a model by Eugenia Shakevich, Joe Galley, and myself, in which we placed on a sphere 100,000 spiking neurons, excitatory and inhibitory in the proper ratios, and hooked up with reentrant connections. And we've asked, would there be spontaneous group formation even in the presence of just input noise? And if you look real hard, you will see these essential clusters. And if you look at the analysis, you'll see that there are lifetimes of these groups, which in fact disappear or don't, depending upon the inputs and what have you. I won't go into detail, but imagine this is 10 times slower than what is happening in your brain right now. And if we're talking cortex, we're talking 30 billion neurons at least, and 1 million billion connections. If you counted one per second, you just finished counting 32 million years later. And we heard about a graph. Well, anyone who looks at graph theory would know, for example, that if you have a graph of 32 vertices and 256 edges, you have 10 to the 700th possible graphs. And God knows how many vertices we have inside here. Well, let me provide a little bit of evidence for neuronal group selection. This is a beautiful experiment done by Wolf Singer in Frankfurt with his colleague Gray, in which he impaled a single visual neuron in the occipital cortex and registered these spikes. And at the same time, he was measuring local field potentials of maybe 100 surrounding neurons. And when he passed this through a computer and looked at the spike correlation with the troughs of the local field potentials, they lined up beautifully. if he took this signal, which was to this cat a moving bar going in that direction, if he took it away, the whole thing collapsed. So it did self-organize, and was, I believe, neuronal groups. Most strikingly, to me at least, is the work of Michael Merzenich at UCSF, who looked at the receptive fields of neurons when he tapped and looked at the somatosensory cortex of the owl monkey, tapped on the various parts of the finger, smooth, glabrous, and hairy, and made a map. And here are the maps of the digits, and the dark ones are the hairy parts in the back. Well, when he cut the nerve, the median nerve that serves this finger on the glabrous side, this finger, and half of this finger, immediately, before it could even get into the skull, eventually within an hour, he could see a huge change in this map, in which all the map boundaries change smoothly. It's very hard to explain this result if there are not recruitment of neuronal groups. Indeed, if he had a monkey tap 100,000 times with this finger, it would, as it were, steal neurons from the other representations, and no two of these individual animals was alike. Well, this may confute what I've said because it looks like a picture of a computer diagram. It is, in fact, Fellerman and Van Essen's early picture of the 33 or so different visual centers in the macaque monkey, hooked up by millions of fibers, most of them reciprocal and therefore capable of undergoing reentrant connectivity. And here's the one that we just looked at, V1. And you go up here. And the striking thing is this. It formulates a problem we all have to struggle with called the binding problem. How does the brain bind together the responses of these functionally segregated areas to one or more objects when there is no executive supervisor? The answer, we believe, is reentry. And this is the idea blown up now, as you see here, that inputs can come into this map and inputs to that map. But if they have these massively parallel connections, at least stochastically, certain mapping will occur among the maps, and that will cause synchrony of firing. Well, let me give you another model, which was done at the Institute, and show you, this time 100 times slower in the brain, what happens when you feed a gestalt into the model of a reentrant cortical system. The stimulus will be figure and ground, again a gestalt figure, and you'll see nothing here until it moves, and then you'll see this rhomboid. There you go. And that's fed into the structure, and we see what happens to the synaptic strengths and the patterns of response of neuronal groups. Well, here you go. Remind yourself that it's moving very slowly so you can see what's going on. Here's the random background. And eventually you'll see that there are correlated firings amongst these things. I've arranged it so you see the rhomboid, but that doesn't matter. It's the coherence and the correlation that count. Well, with that, let me turn to an interesting problem, namely that we can't, even with these brilliant neurophysiologists, record everything that's happening across all the levels I've mentioned. And that is the reason that George Ricci and I, some 20 years ago, began to put together with our colleagues brain-based devices. And I'm going to show you some that were developed in the Neuroscience Institute over the last 12 years, marked by the efforts of Jeff Kritchmar and Anil Seth and a lot of other colleagues. So the idea here was, well, what we want to do is see if we can simulate a brain and a phenotype and a behavior all in one so we can see every level. And that's an important point that I think has to pervade in this meeting. The brain is embodied and the body is embedded, and you can't think of a brain in a vat. It does require this entire interaction, and for that reason we insist that these devices must be situated in the real world and have a morphology. They must engage in a behavior, obviously, and that must be controlled by a simulated nervous system based on the anatomy and dynamics I've mentioned, and finally that this behavior is modified by this reward or value system. Well, let me show you a picture of one of the early brain BBDs, or brain-based devices. This is Darwin 7, and Darwin 7 has a pair of ears, camera eye, IR sensors, and a gripper, which can measure conductance. And we give it blocks. It's attracted to various reflectant surfaces. We give it blocks with either stripes or blobs on them, and we allow it to proceed and investigate its environment all on its own without programming. I want to show you the final result of that conditioning. Time doesn't allow me to show you the actual process in detail, but this is a conditioned response of Darwin 7. As it comes to this block, and here you're seeing a retinal response, an inferotemporal response, and a value system response, meaning appetitive. On this side it would be aversive. Of course, very much more is happening in this system, which has about 400,000 synapses in something like 19 different areas. And as you see, it did pick up the one with stripes, and now it's going to come to one having received aversive stimuli of that kind. It is getting another pattern in IT, and it will not pick it up. It will move away. Now, that's a very primitive behavior, but in fact, it does it all on its own. Let me go on to say that we were challenged by Tony Tether, director of DARPA, who had the grace to visit us. And he said, why don't you see whether you can do robo-soccer? If you put one of your brains in, let's see what happens if you play against an AI bunch. And in fact, I believe it was the first robo-soccer match in which a human and a device would work together as a team against another human and another device. And so we challenged Carnegie Mellon and vice versa, and I thought I'd like you to see what actually happened in one case. Because that situation, of course, requires an enormous amount of flexibility in learning. Well, here is ours, and here's Carnegie Mellon's. Excuse me, here. And here is our person. And as you see, they're able to kick and pass, and the device can recognize its teammate, the opposite side, and its own goal, as well as the opposite goal. And the game is more like ultimate frisbee. They're not allowed to come beyond 3 feet of each other, otherwise they disqualify themselves. And so you'll see this particular sequence in which our device is moving up, getting us a pass from Don, catching it, then proceeding to the goal, I believe. I have to watch it myself and see where it's going. Passing again. And you'll notice that the human on the other side from Carnegie Mellon is guarding the goal, but he's not allowed to move beyond 3 feet. And so our particular device catches the ball, looks around at his teammate, turns around, and shoots for the goal. Well, we won all 5 games, and it doesn't seem to me to be a wonder because, of course, the Darwin automata and this automaton make mistakes, but they learn by making mistakes. They don't crash by making mistakes. So this is sort of challenging, and I'd like to take you up to date in the most recent form of these devices by telling you that we have been able now to put in a hippocampus into the simulated brain. As you will remember, the hippocampus is responsible for spatial location in rodents and also episodic memory. And some of you may have seen the film called Memento, in which a person had both hippocampi removed and therefore didn't have long-term memory. Well, I won't go into detail about this, but these are some of the centers inside. There are 50 such areas inside our simulation. Here is the hippocampus, and here are the various simulated areas. What I would like to do is show you what happens when we try to devise a maze test like what happens to the rat. So here is the water maze of Morris, the Morris water maze, in which you put a rat in a milky solution which has a hidden platform. And rats don't like this water. They go exploring, and they finally find the platform. And then in very short order, they can go directly for the platform wherever you put them. So we constructed a room of this kind. We didn't want our Darwin 10, which is what this is, to get wet. So we formed a hidden platform, black, which it could not see, but its reflectance could be detected by an IR device if it actually went over it. And you notice on the walls there are different various emblems which it can remember in its various explorations. So here is the fact of Darwin 10, and I'm going to show you what happens. By reflex, it goes around, looks at the walls. It doesn't know where it's at now. It's just been put down. It's, as it were, training. It will go around. By the way, those things sticking out there are whiskers. I'm not going to talk about those, but that was an added sense, tactile. And it finally gets a sort of picture of what's going on. And now it has been trained for about 6 or 8 times, and it will now go and move in a more directed fashion. in a very superstitious way. It'll go actually for the blue stripes over there. We don't know why. Its brother, an absolute clone, will not do that. But it does it every single time. And then it moves out and proceeds to go to this area, get a value response from its IR, and stay there. Now we put it in a completely different place. It goes on and up and does exactly the same thing. It'll go toward the blue for some odd reason, superstitious, I suppose. It will go to the blue, form its habit, and come back. And this is an important issue. Each one of these devices is unique, just as we are. No two individuals have the same pattern of neuronal group response. And I think that's sort of interesting. Well, okay. Now let me converge on our subject proper by saying when we look at the way these devices work, we see a real difference in the idea of how memory works. In computer memory, as you know, you have an address to fetch whatever is enclosed, and destructively or non-destructively you take it out, read the code, and you certainly don't want to have errors, and if you do, you need error correction. It's replicative. But in this view, when we look at these devices, we see that it's dynamic memory. The memory is recreating against the new scene something that is an output response that's very similar to the previous one, even though the inputs are quite different. As you can see here, this input gives this circuit, this input gives the same result, but that circuit. Now, in fact, what we're really talking about is a very important biological principle, degeneracy, namely that completely different structures can give you the same output or result. That's true in the genetic code. It's true all the way on up through cell biology, all the way on up to the ambiguities of language. And it's a very important principle. In any case, the kind of memory that a computer has is replicative. It involves instruction. It's largely syntactic. Its reliability, its accuracy, and it's in general non-creative. In our case, it is selection. It's semantic. Its reliability is the achieving of the goal, and it is creative. And by the way, it used to be that I had something to do with music, and I must tell you the apocryphal story of Beethoven's landlady who said, "Beethoven, get out of my house. Your cat drinks my milk, you throw the laundry in the stairwell, and you pound on the piano all night. I can't sleep." He says, "Mrs. Schmidt, you're my inspiration." And she said, "Ha ha ha ha." It'll be interesting if we can have a computer do that. Well, now let me turn to my subject proper and come to the end. Consciousness, that annoying time between naps. And I want to start with James because James did set out the properties or features of consciousness that I think are very important. Namely, consciousness is a form of awareness. It is a process, not a thing. That is constantly made as a mistake over and over again. It is not a thing, it is a process. It's individual or personal. It continues, but it changes. It has intentionality, which is Brentano's term for the fact that it refers usually to something. It's about something, but it doesn't exhaust all the aspects of the things with which it deals. To my mind, one of the most striking features of consciousness is the unitary nature of the conscious scene. Imagine this. If I challenge you and say, try to be conscious just of this, you can't do it. You're conscious of this room, of my gesticulations, of the seat, the pressure on your bottom, etc., etc., etc. And yet, every single time, that scene, unitary as it goes, changes in such a way that if I asked you to remember all your high school classmates, you could go through this endless stream of variation, imagination, and true memory. Well, here is the key, I believe. If it is not in a place, it certainly has to do with certain interactive structures and dynamics in the brain, one of which is the thalamus. The thalamus isn't very much bigger than the end of your thumb, but it carries, except for olfaction, it carries every input on the senses to the cortex and vice versa, and also some motor inputs and outputs. The main thing about it is twofold. One, that there's a huge amount of reentrant signaling between the thalamus and the cortex, and a huge amount of cortical signaling, cortico-cortical interactions, as I've mentioned before. This particular nucleus, the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, envelops it and is an inhibitory nucleus and allows gating of these particular specific nuclei which do not otherwise communicate with each other. So some gating and attentional processes are probably going to be occurring in the thalamus. So it's the thalamocortical system, and we know something about that, namely that young lady Quinlan, who had a stroke and was in a vegetative state persistently. Finally, they removed her feeding, and when they did the postmortem, the cortex was pretty darn normal, but there were no intralaminar nuclei left in the thalamus. And that was the chief pathological finding. And I believe that neurologists will tell you there are thalamic strokes in which you simply disappear as far as consciousness is concerned. So let me go right to the issue. I would propose, in the spirit of TNGS, that what happened about 250 million years ago when therapsid reptiles gave rise to birds and to mammals, there was a huge new reentrant connection made between the more posterior regions doing perceptual categorization and the value category memory we know that is responded to in the more frontal regions of the brain. And I won't go through all of the details of this structure, but of course there's a self and there's an unself part for the input signals. The main point is, though, that this enables such an animal to create a scene, to have many, many discriminations that were otherwise not possible. It doesn't say those discriminations are realistic in the scientific sense, but it does say they have possibilities of mapping onto situations which are non-repeatable and very complex. Well, sometime later, I believe, another reentrant circuit developed in hominid development when the conceptual parts of the brain involve themselves with speech, giving rise to higher order consciousness, in which case you are freed from the remembered present of primary consciousness, of course, which continued, and then could invent all kinds of images, fantasies, dreams, what have you. And of course, this one refers to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, but only symbolically, because it involves much more of the cortex and subcortex than that. Well, so that's the third item. Can we sort of explain how this works? And I believe I must put that off until I show you the actual experiment that we have performed at the Institute involving physics, thank goodness, squids, superconductive quantum interference devices, with Josephson junctions that can pick up very, very minute magnetic fields. And it's non-invasive. It's not very resolving with respect to space, maybe 2 centimeters, 1 to 2 centimeters, but in terms of time, it's exquisite. And here's a picture of the device and an individual. 148 of these in this particular version are reading all over the brain. And you must remember this is focal and local. It's not like electroencephalography in which you have volume conductors in the brain. You can actually do a dipole analysis, not very precise, I must say, but importantly different than what happens there. And if you had red and blue glasses, and that's what we do, we put the person in a room, as I showed you, with red and blue glasses, and show this pattern here. Now, the orthogonality means that your brain cannot, in fact, fuse those images, so you get binocular rivalry. And the person will experience red, vertical, blue, horizontal, red, vertical, blue, horizontal, maybe every 2 or 3 seconds. People differ in that respect, not surprisingly. And so this is what they would see. They would be getting these inputs into the brain constantly, but the percept would be either red, vertical, then nothing, then blue. And we asked them to record that, so we can record both the output in terms of encephalography, magnetoencephalography, and also the response contour. After doing a Fourier analysis, we can then see what's what, except there's one little trouble. We have to know what corresponds in the brain responses to the input signal. And here we were fortunate to think of using frequency tags, namely, take the left eye, for example, and oscillate the intensity of the red verticals and the blue at a different frequency. So the red, say, at 9.5 hertz and the blue at 7.39 hertz, and then see whether there's a spike that identifies that particular response. And there is, about 30-to-1 signal-to-noise ratio, so we can now do this by doing a Fourier analysis at each one of these frequencies. I would just suggest that you pay no attention to these, but look at these. This is the front of the brain. Unfortunately, the contours are probably not showing up here. They go well beyond this color scale. And what we do is subtract the non-conscious portion from the conscious portion, and we get a plot which indicates that there are some parts of the brain that shut off and some parts that go on. And consonant with what I've been saying, no 2 individuals are alike. When we look at them, they still have this focal response. It's not just a global response, but different areas and different portions of individual brains, not surprisingly, given their past histories, seem to respond in power. Now, that's all very well, but much more exciting was this idea of looking for the possibility of reentry. And so what we did is, in fact, developed an analysis involving the coherence and looked at distant electrodes and asked which ones were synchronized together when they became conscious, after we subtracted, of course, the unconscious contribution. And here are two examples. There's a huge, massive synchronous firing across these various parts of the brain in both these individuals, who, of course, are individual and do differ. And we think that's prima facie evidence and suggestion for a reentrant process. Well, let me now summarize and say the first thing is that we know that these processes involve big changeabilities. I mentioned that. In fact, even though the integration of the thalamocortical system will give you this unitary pattern, the fact is that changes in all kinds of ways from input or the brain speaking to itself. And so we postulate that, in fact, the thalamus and the thalamocortical system, it's beginning to respond, constitute what we call a dynamic core. And that dynamic core is a set of neuronal interactions through reentry that speak mainly to themselves, only less frequently to the rest of the brain, although they're certainly coupled to unconscious regions such as subcortical areas, basal ganglia, and what have you. So the hypothesis states that a group of neurons, I wonder if that's me. Let me see.
I'm going to switch you over to the podium.
Oh, all right. Well, no, it's all right. I think I've fixed my deviation. Am I back? Thank you. All right. A group of neurons could contribute directly to conscious experience only if it is part of a distributed functional cluster, which means that it's talking mainly to itself, which through reentrant interactions in the thalamocortical system achieves high integration in hundreds of milliseconds. And that hundreds of milliseconds is important because otherwise you could not experience how the integration changes and shifts in time. Speak about a graph. It must be an amazing structure, and we do not have a picture at the local microcircuit level yet. Well, let me make another comment, and that has to do with causality, and this is worth arguing about. There are people, quite respectable people, who believe that, in fact, consciousness is causal. I want to take the contrary view. I do not believe that's feasible. I think what, in fact, is causal is the neurons of the dynamic core that entail these phenomenal properties of consciousness. And this dynamic core is interacting with the world by input and output, and that there's self-systems and non-self systems, and they provide world interactions, and finally the brain speaking to itself through memorial processes, fantasy, imaging, and what have you. Now, it's important to make this point, that in fact, the fact that consciousness is a process, thermodynamically speaking, makes it impossible to consider, unless you can give me a thermodynamic argument that says how I work the entropy and the enthalpy, it's impossible to consider that consciousness itself would cause anything. This is a horrible reaction of philosophers. They hate it. They call it epiphenomenalism. But in fact, if you consider that the core is faithful and that all the particular integrated states are going to correspond to your experience, this in your privacy, then it's no different than saying that hemoglobin doesn't cause its Surrey band or its red color. It entails it. The quantum mechanical structure entails that color. And so I believe that this is what we end up with as a hypothesis, that conscious states which are unitary and change serially in time and have wide-ranging contents and access and are modulated by attention reflect subjective feelings and qualia, and that those qualia are entailed by these core states, so that the evolution of this dynamic core, as I proposed to you, provided a vastly increased number of sensory motor discriminations to those species that had it, and that was an adaptive advantage in evolution. I believe any consciousness theory that you project must be consistent with evolutionary change. And then finally, the qualia are just those discriminations which are entailed by the different core states. What's really interesting about this is that it probably is the case that the same system is handling the solution to Fermat's last theorem as a fight between husband and wife. And the emotional states and even the integral states of removed abstraction that philosophers and mathematicians have, all of those probably are taking place within this system, and that the combinatorial interactions are simply hair-raising. This is something that I believe we have to face. The question is, it may be true, everything I've said, but we've got to understand the microscopic integration properties of this system, and so far we don't have measurement systems that really do that except indirectly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I started with a lady poet. I'll end with one. And this is Emily Dickinson, who in 1862 wrote this poem in which the brain was the metonym for the mind. It's obvious she was talking about the mind. She said, "The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound." Well, let me summarize. I believe we are, and in fact this room is, at a remarkable juncture in neuroscience and computer science and a variety of other challenges. We're on the brink of beginning to understand something that belonged only to the philosophers, but now has become a reasonable precinct for scientists to explore. And I believe, as has been the case in other questions that could not yet be answered and were therefore the domain of philosophy, this too will yield. How it will yield is an interesting point. I can say this, that if everything I've said is true in some degree or another, then every perception is to some degree an act of creation. And every act of memory is to some degree an act of imagination. And the idea of the precision that we love so much in computing is an idea that's posterior. That is to say that ambiguity is powerful because interacting degenerate systems cause associativity, and we need that to start with. If I start with minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, and you say write a poem, and I say minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, you don't get much of a poem. And you don't, in fact, even get a good theory. So metaphors begin. Of course, they're poor theories, and we must, of course, apply all the precision of computation, of mathematics, and all our analysis to those things that they can be applied to. But I don't believe that the situation is such that you will have reductive naturalism, that every single thing will be reduced. I don't think that's a weakness. I think science stands as the greatest human cultural institution, with enormous generality notwithstanding. So let me finally say that my own imagination goes to the notion that if we get better at doing these kinds of BBDs, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a perception Turing machine? If in cases of non-computability, whether for formal reasons or because there are enormous numbers of parameters, we could hook a suitably constructed BBD in the world, speaking to get subroutines from a very large, maybe Blue Gene or something of that kind, computer. That would really be an advance, and a very exciting one indeed. Finally, of course, I hazard the proposal that we will, in some event, be able to construct a conscious automaton. Tony Tether said to me, "Why aren't you working on that?" He said, "Of course, you'll probably be gone 50 years before it really works, but don't let that discourage you. Get to work." The fact is, it will be a very interesting thing because it'll be the first time that epistemology becomes an experimental science. If you put a body into this thing, it won't be our body, but if it had a primitive language and could report, as in that experiment I showed you, and you could ask it questions that would take a look at how it responded to what we call reality, that would be almost as exciting, Dan, as something from outer space. And probably sooner, but I don't want to encourage a dispute on that ground. In any case, we are on the verge. It's a very exciting time, and I think this will be a very exciting symposium and meeting for that reason, even beyond all the others. Thank you.
Are there questions?
There is something that puzzled me a little bit towards the end. So you define or explain conscious as a process.
Would you repeat that question for me? Because Would you speak up? Where are you, ma'am?
Right here.
Oh, there you are. Good, wave. Fine. Thank you.
Okay, you described consciousness as a process and
Yeah.
then talk about conscious states.
Conscious
states.
States, yes, of course.
Yeah, so what would
But
be the...
processes can have states.
Sure, but then you're just making freezes over the dynamics? That's
Well,
what
of
you
course,
would call...
that's how we sample it. Of course, in
So
order to study it, we
what do
sample
you
it that way.
call
But it's a
state?
continuous process as far as we know. Phenomenologically, it's continuous. There are some people who believe that it spikes. There's an argument there, but I believe that the notion of the stream of consciousness that James put forth is an apt metaphor for what's going on.
And then if you call these freezing pictures on the way conscious states, isn't it also what you called qualia? Or you see it different?
Qualia, look, the system is powerful because it enables an animal who has that system to reintegrate whole discrimination scenes, like complex scenes, and then react accordingly. All right? Let me give you the example of an animal in a forest. I just made this up. It may or may not be right. An animal in a forest that's had a certain experience, and it's about dusk, and light is descending, and he hears a cooing noise, and the wind shifts to the west, and he runs like hell. Well, a physicist would look at that and say, they aren't even connected. Why did he run? Well, in his past, he may have had an experience related to his value system which said that combination is not good. So, for example, if you told me a tiger was going to come from that door that made that sound, and I said, well, let's wait and experiment, I don't believe you'd want me to do it. So the qualia are, in fact, in my opinion, the discriminatory states. And the fact is that they are multidimensional, as I've said in this unitary scene. They are, in fact, not explicable in the scientific sense that you can say, I'll give you a theory that will make you feel warm. To feel warm, you have to have the privacy of your own body and that discriminative ability. And I don't believe that the so-called hard problem is a problem that requires a solution. It requires a cure. I think the fact is that if you said to a physicist he shouldn't do anything in physics because he hasn't answered why there's something rather than nothing, it's the same problem. Qualia can be distinguished because, in fact, the neural inputs to different qualia are quite different. And so that's part of the reason. It's not all of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned associating consciousness with integration
Yes.
over hundreds of milliseconds. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, the fact is, how shall I say, propelled by this notion of the unitary scene and by the notion that I showed you in that experiment where there's this huge reentrant explosion. That does involve integration in the sense that particular degenerate circuits are effective in giving you a particular output. And the reason I said in hundreds of milliseconds is that if it weren't so, it would be very difficult to account for the changes. For example, as I'm speaking, I see Mr. Golden moving over, I hear a certain hissing noise, etc. And they occur in reasonably short periods of time. So that is what the problem is how to deal with a formal analysis of the discrimination and integration in the thalamocortical system when you're talking about millions upon millions of reentrant fibers and dynamics. There are, in fact, I should say, complexity analyses where we have looked at the various measures of that integration. None of them turn out to be terrifically practical at this moment, but they involve looking at the local independence of regions of the brain versus the coupling when you have the reentrant integration. And you can make certain measures that will respond to that set of events. But that's not the same as having the analytic indicator of what's going on in all the degrees in the thalamocortical circuits.
So I had a question regarding your simulations.
Yes.
It seems that the same behavior could be elicited by many programs.
Many
so
what?
Many plants, many programs that could elicit the same behavior. So how do you attribute that to a theory of the brain?
Oh, here's the point. There isn't a program. The point is that that behavior is not engaged as a program. There is no prior set of instructions that does X, Y, and Z. What is simulated are the circuitry, the kind of thing I suppose Henry Markram will be talking about, the circuitry in those complex interactions. They are what are occurring. It's not that a program is telling it what to do. Now, of course, after the event, you can always write a program. As who was it? E.M. Forster said in one of his novels, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? So in fact, when you get one of these, you can certainly do a program. There's no doubt.
So a related question to that is, what's the effect of attention?
Oh, that's a lovely question, yes. We don't understand very much about attention. Attention does bear on this question of Brentano, intentionality. Namely, not everything we're conscious of is about something. For example, a mood, you're conscious of a mood, and it's hardly a thing that you can point to, per se. But there's a large element of that, and the element must be modulated by attention. Now, there are different stages of attention, and people who worked in neurophysiology have shown that prefrontal and parietal cortex seem to be remarkably closely involved in attentive procedures of various kinds. So you can think of diffuse attention, maybe the cortex alone could do that, but focal attention, I believe, would occur when the nucleus of the thalamus, the reticular nucleus of the thalamus, gates different inhibitory combinations of input streams. So as it were, you are dark with respect to the ones that don't input, etc. And finally, my personal belief is that basal ganglia, being a very large inhibitory organism, are probably the most powerful form of inserting focal attention. But that has not been shown yet, and it is, of course, a very critical question in our analysis of consciousness. The main thing, it is not the same as consciousness. It is what modulates consciousness. Yes, there was.
I guess I'm a little confused over here.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess I'm a little confused at your distinction between consciousness and science or programs or whatever, because I may be a reductionist at heart. I'm an electrical engineer, but it seems to me there is an underlying machine that executes some set of actions. You can write programs that are stochastic in nature.
Okay.
You can have randomness as part of that. What's the distinction?
All right, let me ask you a question. Do you think that evolution is a Turing machine?
I think evolution is a Turing machine.
Yeah. Think on that a while,
Well,
because in fact,
think
there is no observer, there are no programs, there's a set of variations,
but I
and
can
a set of unpredicted events, which then make selections, which then themselves change the repertoire of
But
change.
as many
etc.
people who build genetic algorithms will say, I can write a computer simulation that will simulate many of the effects that
Yes.
people say underlying evolution.
Yeah.
So
Yes, you can, but what you can't do is, in fact, do it ab initio without you involving yourself. That is to say, that's what happens in evolution. I believe that's what happens in your brain. But yes, there's a discussable point here. After the event is described, you can always write a program. But what is it you would say?
But, okay, so let me take it a different way, which is that you say the brain isn't adaptable, there's this thing. But there has to be some underlying process that caused the brain. The brain is all different. The neural selections are all different in every person. That's true. But there is a process over which that gives some remarkable similarities between the behaviors of all the resulting systems.
Sure, and that's because we have value systems acting as constraints and phenotypes acting as constraints. If I were a violinist and someone offered to replace my right arm, my bow arm, with the most remarkable tentacle of an octopus that's even more flexible than my arm, I'd reject it, because in fact the joints are responsible for doing spiccato. So all of what you're saying is true in the sense that after you know what's going on, you can write a program. But the challenge is, can you write a program, and I don't take it that genetic algorithms are a program for evolution, to explain the evolutionary features of the system, because I don't believe evolution is a Turing machine. For example, if it is, why don't you write a program and tell me what we'll look like in 1,000,000 years? So there are these uncertainties in these systems implicit in the variation. Now, from a biological point of view, that's not a challenge. That's what Darwin did to add to physics. Physicists in general have done magnificent things, but they haven't really dealt with this point of Darwin, namely, the variation is the substrate for a making category of the kind you're talking about. What was amazing is that from the bottom up, without Aristotelian ladders or Platonic derivations of 2 to the nth coming top down, the scala naturae, you actually take variation, and from variation you make consistency called species. That is the essential idea, and I don't believe we have, in fact, written a program that does anything except reflect certain known properties after the event of that. We can discuss this some more. There is an interesting problem here that really is interesting. That is, if there's dice tossing in the event, can the thing remain a Turing machine? There's a very distinguished gentleman called Chaitin in your organization who's just written a marvelous article who deals with this kind of question. I believe if there's dice tossing at the fundamental level, you can't have what we call a Turing machine. Now, Turing was a genius, and he started to talk about other kinds of machines, oracle machines and things, but didn't spell them out, alas. So.
One of the most important observations about how computers work is that the abstract states of binary arithmetic and Boolean algebra are mapped onto the physical states of whatever particular instantiation of a Turing machine we happen to be talking about.
Yep.
You've given us a great survey and an intriguing set of hypotheses about the physical states of the brain.
Right.
Do you think there is an analogous set of abstract states that in effect constitute the fundamental computational primitives of the brain that we've yet to discover? You've offered selection as a global characteristic,
right.
But do you believe that there are more fundamental abstract states that constitute the first transition between the physical states we know about from neuroscience and whatever other abstract states there may be?
That's a very good question, too. I think the fact that is before us is the following, that the local features of various brain areas and their interactions remain to be explored in detail. For example, take basal ganglia, which are of enormous significance in motor control. The one problem I think we haven't really solved in any direction so far in neuroscience, and the most important one. We have to learn about all of those things. Yes, the fact is that when we do learn about them, we can construct machine correlates that will have certain features, but remember the issue that comes up when I say, supposing I had an octopus arm rather than this arm. The brain is embodied. So let me give you an example of that from a clinical point of view. There's a disease called anosognosia. I don't know if you've heard of it. But if you have a parietal stroke over here in the parietal cortex, you have hemi-neglect. You're not attentive to the whole left side of the world. You can see from 12 to 6, but that's it, not 6 to 12. You shave on this side, et cetera, et cetera. If you have a slightly larger stroke, occasionally a syndrome called anosognosia will occur. And this is important in relation to your question. I hope I'm not deviating too much. It is this, that a patient with anosognosia doesn't even recognize that they're paralyzed. They're not crazy, they're not unintelligent, they're not neurotic. They have this massive stroke. And Dr. Biziak, who's the great scholar of this field in Milan, came up to one of his patients and he said, I have two identical cubes here, Bertolucci. I'm going to put one in your left hand and one in mine. Now you do what I do. And the patient said, there, doc, I did it. He said, no, you didn't. The patient said, of course I did. He pulled the patient's arm into his right visual field and said, whose hand is this? And the patient said, yours. He said, I can't have three hands. And the patient said, doc, it stands to reason. If you got three arms, you have to have three hands. This is a very important thing. If we could explain this in relation to what you're talking about, that's what the problem is. It's the interaction of non-repetitive events with phenotypic structure that we can't fully encompass until after the event. How do I know what I think until I see what I say? So yes, the germ of an answer is there in your question. We certainly should try to do as much as we can to deal, but we will have to take care to not read out the problem of the environment and of the embodiment. I think those interactions are terribly important. That's what the Merzenich experiments are so exciting about. Violinists, by the way, left hand. There's a huge map. They're busy doing this all the time. No two alike, but the principle is the same, and yes, this is true in evolution too, even if it's not a Turing machine. It has to converge in some kind of mapping for survival, not necessarily, however, for truth. And that, I think, is a very important point, because let me pose it another way and toss it out to you. Supposing we did understand everything about how your brain worked, and even say my brain worked, although I don't want to hear about it. So do you think you would not work by beliefs, desires, and intentions? Would anyone let you to work otherwise, except beliefs, desires, and intentions? Do you believe that your illusion of time, namely of a movement from the past through the present to the future, is actually a correct descriptor, when in fact the past and future are concepts and only the remembered present is the one you're experiencing right now. Well, we have many of these illusions. They're useful. Evolution does them. And to answer your question ultimately, I suppose what we have to do is have a go at it. But I think that one of the great challenges will be this variability. Yeah.
Let me thank Dr. Edelman. We've run out of time.
10-minute break.